Right, we are now live, and this is going to be a rather controversial one, I imagine, uh, for these Dr. Sadler philosophy pop-ups, which are these sort of impromptu discussions that I have online with my viewers and subscribers and other people who show up. So we're going to be talking today about all of the protests and the police responses here in America, particularly here in the Midwest, not just in Milwaukee, where I'm broadcasting from right now, where we had some significant protests ourselves in the last couple days, but in other cities as well. And I want to discuss quite a bit of this from ethical perspectives. Those of you who are weighing in on this, I've already had to delete some people's comments because, like I say in the video description, make sure to keep it relevant, make sure to keep it civil. We are discussing this whole set of matters that are catalyzed by the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis by Minneapolis police officers, in particular the one who's been charged, Derek Chauvin. And we're going to be talking about larger issues of policing and how it can be done well and what's wrong with it and how it bears heavily on some communities much more than others. I'll tell you right off the bat, I am not a sort of on one extreme or the other kind of person. I have quite a few cops in my family who've worked in different aspects of policing, and it really is the truth that good cops do need to start speaking up against bad cops and what's going on, and that there's far too little of that. I'm also not for police abolition. I think that's kind of a utopian idea that's not particularly helpful at this time. So what I'm going to be talking about largely comes from the middle and is coming also from thinking about, again, the ethical perspectives that stepping back a little bit would help us to focus on rather than knee-jerk responses. So, a lot of these questions about, Choron and all that. Listen, I'm not going to do that in this pop-up. We're going to be talking about sort of nuts and bolts stuff. We're not going to be trying to adjust things that I think don't have much impact on the immediate situation to what we have to talk about here. So let's talk about the situation itself, and I'll do kind of a thumbnail sketch because we do have a lot of foreign viewers and subscribers who get onto these things. Here in the United States, we do not have a national policing sort of protocol or system or anything like that. It's very, very localized. So each city has its own police force, which could be good or could be bad. The leadership could be corrupt, as it was here in Milwaukee just recently, when we had our Sheriff David Clark in charge of the sheriff's department, who subsequently went on to try to, glom onto the Trump administration, be a Fox News host. You know him, the guy with all the medals that he gave himself. He was in charge of the sheriff's department, which is in charge of county policing here. So you can have people like that, and then the next municipality over, you might have somebody who's a very conscientious, ethical police chief. Training varies incredibly across the board for officers. There are some police departments that are at this point, so rotten that they probably need to be rooted out from the ground up and everyone fired and bring in new people. There are others who are quite good. So, for a lot of people don't quite get this. There is no single policing system here that does things. That said, you can say that throughout our American cities, where we do have quite a lot of racial inequalities that go back generations, sometimes centuries, the brunt of policing often does fall quite heavily on those who are disadvantaged in different ways, and race is one of the ways in which that happens. Here in Milwaukee, we have one of the most still segregated cities in the United States. So you can bet that that is going to be a significant problem. Now, the issue itself, people, are going to want to talk about, and there has been a lot of discourse on Twitter and on Facebook and in other social media, of course, in the news as well, and in opinion sources about George Floyd in particular and about Derek Chauvin in particular. But this is, you might say, sort of I said it was a catalyst because it's a symbol of a much larger problem. The marches here in Milwaukee, they didn't just reference George Floyd or, with the I Can't Breathe, other incidents like the one in New York City, right? They're referencing people who've been killed here in Milwaukee in the last 10 years. And this is the case in cities all over the place. We can usually find some sort of incident. The marches here in Milwaukee often begin at Red Arrow Park, where an officer killed a homeless man back, if I remember right, in 2014. So there's a lot of deep roots for these conflicts going on. And these are ethical conflicts. So there's a long-standing problem of racism. How should we look at racism from ethical perspectives? There are people who want to try to justify it by appeals to, evolutionary biology or things like that. It's very difficult to find any ethicist today who, and this has not always been the case, by the way. The intelligentsia back in the 20s and 30s here in the United States, as well as in Germany and other places, kind of took racism to be, the way to understand things. I think now in the present, we've made enough moral progress where we can recognize that from just about any ethical perspective you want to pick, if it's worth a damn, racism is wrong. It's, even if we think about it in terms of religious ethics, you can recognize it as sinful, as in some respects disgusting. Myself, I come from a family, my adopted family, who are quite explicitly anti-racist, although struggling with their own biases. But I think about my own father and getting in fights with people in northern Wisconsin who are trying to say that what Hitler did was okay, and thinking about growing up here in this area. We have a long-standing problem with racism in a number of different ways, and it's not simply a matter of individual biases or assumptions. It can be systematic, and I think anybody who wants to try to deny that there is systematic racism in quite a few of our institutions, which include policing, but also often include education and medical matters, all of which, by the way, are the same decentralized mess as policing is. I think it has some sort of agenda to try to deny evident realities, or they've been under a stone forever, and then those are people who you can reach. And so there's an ethical problem not only of engaging in racism or furthering racist attitudes, but of denying it as well, of pretending that it doesn't exist and that it's not affecting things. The police responses to the protests, it's interesting. I've been engaging in some discussion on Twitter and on Facebook over the last couple days as I've been posting things. By the way, also losing followers and likers on those. I'm sure I'll eventually get some other people back. And I will say this as a side note too. If talking about these things is enough to make somebody say, "Oh, I don't want that in my stream," screw them. I'm glad to see them go. We're carrying out sort of a winnowing process here. And I think that this really is a catalyzing set of events that are going to be quite important. You can hear sirens now again in the city. There was probably something going on even today. So going on with this, talking about the protests, I think it's perfectly legitimate to protest en masse about this sort of extrajudicial killing, which is what it is, and about the sort of mentality and the systems and the justifications and excuses that allow this to become commonplace. It makes sense that people would march. Here in Milwaukee, we had marchers going throughout the city, quite a long route that actually took them only 2 blocks away from our apartment, where we were watching from the windows, and then we watched the police come through. The police responses, in many cases, have been not only in how they actually attacked people, but in just the lining up and cordoning people off, have been excessive. You know, we have highly militarized police forces here in the United States, and that's a topic we'll get into in a moment. I think that should definitely not be the case, and that rot has been allowed to continue for years. I had my good friend of mine, Caleb, who's a veteran as well, on to talk about this years ago when we were seeing this as a big problem. But the police responses to the protesters, in many cases, attempting to provoke. Clearly, I mean, it's amazing what we can see because there's so many people recording on their phones the stuff that otherwise would have been poo-pooed and said, "Oh, no, 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 the police never do that sort of thing." This is the time when citizens, military and veterans, and fellow law enforcement officers ought to be engaging in clear, unequivocal condemnation of police misconduct. That's an ethical imperative, I believe. And those who don't want to do it, again, they probably need to look into their own motivations for why they would like to say things like, "Oh, it's only the protesters acting violent towards the police." Now, there are some cases where people stirred stuff up, right? And I'm not going to say that it's all outside agitators. There are many people who are quite angry, which we'll talk about in a moment as well. And some of the anger is you could say, misplaced and poorly managed anger. And there are some people who are, career criminals participating in protests, but that's not the majority of them. And for the police to line up and treat people, their own fellow citizens, their own residents of their own city, except the police, of course, who don't live in the city because they've been allowed by police unions, which are essentially just organizations to cover up police misconduct. They've ceased to be any sort of labor union long ago. That sort of stuff, there's no justification for it. Instead, we could look at models of policing where that didn't happen, where things didn't get out of hand, and say, well, it doesn't have to go this way. The police are used to doing things like that, and many of them as individuals, quite clearly you can see them looking forward to going and cracking some heads or spraying some people's faces. But that doesn't justify it at all. As a matter of fact, and I'm getting a little bit off topic here, but one of the things I'd like to assert from an ethical perspective, police officers should be held to higher standards than ordinary people. There should be zero excuse and zero tolerance for abuses of power. When you allow that, the few bad apples idea, then they do corrupt the rest. So many people keep forgetting about this bad apples metaphor that, when you do have a barrel of apples and there is one or two bad apples, it all goes to crap because you didn't pull them out. We need to have much better screening for police officers. We need to have oversight. We need retraining. We need to make policing into a profession where it's not attracting people who look at, TV shows and say, "Oh, I want to go and beat some people up. I want to have arbitrary power over other people." We need to screen those psychos out and bring in people who can actually deal with other, quite often upset human beings as human beings. I remember when I was teaching in Indiana State Prison, and I interact with COs all the time. That was my first full-time teaching job, teaching full-time behind the walls of a maximum security prison where they carried out executions. You could tell which officers were the ones who were in it for good reasons because of the way they treated people, other staff, inmates, those of us who came in to teach. And you could tell the ones that were the rotten apples who should have been pulled out of there and gotten rid of and put into some other job or whatever else is going to happen to them. And you can say the same about police forces, I would say as well. What we need is a drastic overhaul of things. The other thing that I do want to say is about anger. So there is a lot of anger about police brutality. There's quite a bit in the communities that have been negatively affected by this for a long time. There's quite a bit of it on the part of other communities that look at this and they say, this is injustice that cries out to heaven, or whatever other metaphor you want to say, you know. And then there's plenty of anger on the part of the people who are saying, oh, you know, they shouldn't riot, they should be, you know, peaceful all the time, and, you know, they'll do a couple MLK quotes and stuff like that. There's a lot of anger out there in general, right? And then there's angry cops. I mean, being a cop by its very nature places one at a greater risk for mismanagement of anger, and puts weapons into your hands that can be deadly force against people, and, you know, doesn't necessarily, depending on the department, um, doesn't prepare people well for dealing with that. I think what we need to recognize here is that there is a lot of displaced and mismanaged anger, and that should be condemned. You know, that shouldn't be an excuse for engaging in something. And then there's also legitimate anger. And so, you know, some people have said, well, why don't they direct it just at the, you know, the governmental processes? Well, they have been. I mean, it's not as if the discussions about police brutality and how it, you know, impinges on the African American community, particularly on young men, haven't been going on for years and years and years. Here in Milwaukee, here in so many other places. But, you know, and the last thing that I'll say, and then I'll start answering questions, is that you know, I'm not saying I'm those of you who are saying we need to abolish the police. I don't agree with that. I think we need to drastically defund the police. I think we need to reduce police budgets. Minneapolis, there's this great Forbes article that came out a while ago that targeted Minneapolis in particular as one of the places that blows a lot of their budget on policing. This is what allows cops to have all this riot gear and, you know, CS gas and, you know, all this other stuff. That, and of course the corrupt police unions that we need to get rid of as well. I'm not saying that police officers need to be without any sort of legal representation or something like that, but the unions that exist, they need to go, because they are not labor unions. They are just essentially criminal organizations to cover up police misconduct. We could spend a lot less on policing and get way better results than we are by holding, you know, officers to higher standards, by reducing the size of police forces, by telling them you don't get to you know, roll out in gear that our military doesn't actually need to have in order to handle things well. All right, so I'm going to, there's a lot of comments here, and we'll address that. So Ulf Viking says troops need to be brought in. I agree. And I think that we ought to bring in the military and have the military in between the police and the protesters. And I think the military ought to be directed against the police departments that are engaging in violent behavior on their own part. And I think that, you know, by the way, we were talking about this morning, you know, other than the ones who actually went and served in Afghanistan or Iraq, the National Guard are not taken seriously by actual veterans and people in the real military. You know, they're often what we call weekend warriors. They're the people who, you know, have a civilian job and then they go play soldier, and then, you know, they're happy to get called out so that they can screw around within our cities. I'm actually cool with bringing in the military, because the military should be used to keep the police in line. Now, that's probably not what you had in mind. So, all right. Lenny Penny, how would a Nietzschean act in these times? Who cares? You know, that's not relevant here. Mother says, peace and love from Portland. Yeah, that's good. Another about Camus the Rebel. Okay, could Camus the Rebel be relevant for the current riots? Yeah, in a certain way. I mean, if you read Camus' work, he was always in a difficult position where he said that you know, by the way, you know, in Myth of Sisyphus, it's suicide that's the philosophical problem. By the time of the Rebel, it's murder. It's murder that is the problem that's produced by the absurd. And it's something that we need to take account of. And we need to think about how we ourselves, whether we like it or not, are caught up in systems that do engage in murder. And we could say not just murder, but oppression and exploitation of our fellow human beings. Now, Camus was not a utopian. He realized how difficult the situation was in so many cases. And he said, well, we still have to try to do something, and we have to stand up for decency. And a lot of people gave him a very hard time because during the very brutal Algerian War, he refused to take a side as being the good guys that he was going to back all the way. So actually, Camus is kind of relevant here. Stupid comment by where's my eyebrow, nice facial hair. Who gives a shit? Diabolus ex machina, doesn't pragmatism provide many of our solutions of this for both sides? I mean, pragmatic philosophy could play a role in this, but don't think that any sort of philosophical system is going to come in and fix this sort of thing. All it can do is provide us insights, and pragmatism can mean a million different things to a million different people. So I wouldn't put too much on that. All right. Jacob, the violence, vandalism, and looting don't seem like moral means. Am I missing something? Why aren't more public officials urging nonviolent means? Plenty of public officials are urging nonviolent means. They've been urging it forever. Sometimes, and by the way, we can easily say, yes, there's problems with violence, with looting. The violence, however, is coming mostly from the cops, quite frankly. The looting is happening by protesters, but many of them aren't actually protesters. Like great example here in Milwaukee, the looting didn't happen until well after curfew, right? The marches were perfectly fine. There weren't a lot of problems with that. Thank God we don't have that idiot Sheriff Clark here in town anymore, because if we did, then his sheriffs would have been using brutal force against protesters, guaranteed. But we can say that we don't condone and we actually condemn the looting and violence, and we can also say it's a natural response to people who are oppressed and are ignored, and then see one of their fellow human beings treated in the same way that they're becoming accustomed to see by police somewhere else. Those are not incompatible thoughts. And that's important to keep in mind. For everybody who's boggled by the violence of the protesters, if you're not as concerned about the police's violence, and not just in suppressing the protests, but day to day, you lose any moral credibility. All right. Ayman, what does my wife and partner think about these riots? She's pretty much on the same line, same page as me, I think. We've talked about it quite a bit. Nicholas, thank you from Southern California. We need philosophers to guide us through this. Again, I don't think philosophy is going to provide us that much guidance per se, but it can add some useful voices in there, and maybe confirm some things here and there. All right. Here's a good question from the undiscovered self. Aren't good cops that do not talk about bad cops really, in fact, bad cops by dint of collusion, by silence? And the answer is yes. Like I said, when you have a barrel full of apples and you want to claim that there's just a few bad apples in it, you're not going to have just a few bad apples after a couple weeks. So if you have a police department where people are looking away from the evils, I want to just call them evils, that bad cops are imposing on the people who they're supposed to be protecting and serving, the people who they're paid and trained to take care of, when the police are actually the predators, and you don't say anything about it, yes, you become a bad cop. You don't become as bad a cop, right? But you do become a bad cop. And inevitably, these things have a corrupting effect. If you see your fellow officers engaging in injustice, the same thing goes, by the way, for prisons and correctional officers, and getting away with it, eventually you're going to start, inevitably being tempted to do the same sort of things yourself. And so, it's very difficult to maintain any sort of moral perspective. This is why it's so important that we have oversight and leadership of police departments that doesn't accept those sorts of, well, it's what we have to do kinds of excuses, or it's always been done this way, or we're, cracking down, but only on the criminals sorts of excuses. There needs to be real examination and analysis of what happens. And fortunately, we have these mobile devices that are allowing us as citizens to broadcast what police are doing. Because think about what it would be like if we didn't have cell phones and people weren't filming the police. If it's this bad right now, what would it be like if there was no checking up on them? All right. Let's see. Jacob, does some of this pertain to Nietzsche beyond good and evil and optics? I don't know how it would pertain to beyond good and evil in particular. I mean, optics is an interesting term to use here. I think we've lived in a time when there's been maybe too much attention given to optics and not enough attention given to how things actually are happening. You know, too much attention to spinning messages and not enough to basic decency and its violations by the very people who are supposed to be protecting those. Being predatory on the populations who are essentially kept there in ghettos. Again, here in Milwaukee, very segregated community. You wouldn't guess it from where we live in the downtown, because this is a very diverse area. And there's other places like neighborhoods like River West where it's quite diverse. But then there's other places where it's all like predominantly African American or predominantly Hispanic. Even there's even like a little Asian area, or predominantly white, if you look at the greater Milwaukee area. And that's a problem. You know, some of the poorest zip codes in the United States are here in Milwaukee. And it's not, you know, it's not a just sort of surprise. Who knew that this was the case? We have been talking about this for years and years and years. This is one of the most intractable problems that we have here in this great city of Milwaukee. The fact of these vast racial disparities that affect not just policing, but who gets medical care. The COVID crisis has been bearing heavily on that, where businesses get located, education, all of these things are part of that. All right, Stacy Washington, thanks for what you do. I have a philosophy BA from Utah. Okay, that's good. John Doe, thank you, Greg. Now denounce the fascist police state that is the USA. There isn't a fascist police state that is the USA. I mean, there isn't a system in place when it comes to policing. This is something I was saying earlier. We have every single county has its own sheriffs, right? And that's its own entity. They're not accountable to the federal government. They're not accountable to the state government. In the South, sometimes the sheriffs are the most powerful policing entity there is. Up here, it's a little bit more restricted. Then each municipality has its own police force. Then we have our state troopers, and that's a whole different ballgame. You know, then what do we have in terms of federal police state? Well, we have our different agencies, right? Like Border Patrol, which is by itself a corrupt mess of racists, as we know, right? Or all federal marshals or things like that. But those are just a small amount compared to all the local policing. So, you know, why would I denounce the police state that is the USA? That's ridiculous. All right, Stacy Washington writes, teachers include visiting professor. I have no idea what this is about here. So I'm going to skip it. All right, Nicholas Gomez, if police throw tear gas into a crowd of people, is it unethical to throw the tear gas back at the police? I don't know the answer. Does authority make some degree of violence permissible? No. As a matter of fact, authority means that they have to be more circumspect about their use of violence. With more responsibility and more privileges come a greater obligation to, first of all, follow the law and to be proportionate in the use of violence. Is there a problem with throwing tear gas back at the police? No. The police shouldn't be using tear gas at this point anyway. I think that in a lot of cases, police seem to want to ratchet up the violence so that they can use the overwhelming force that they typically have at any given point, because that's the way they like to solve problems. But they are generating more and more and more problems by doing that. I mean, we are at the point now with police in different places. Again, here in Milwaukee, fortunately, we seem to have decent leadership of the police at this point in time. But, police are indiscriminately firing rubber bullets at people. They're attacking medical personnel. They're attacking reporters, the press. They're way out of control in quite a few places. There is nothing wrong with throwing tear gas back at them. I mean, it's not going to be that effective because they've got gas masks, right? That's why they're using tear gas. All right. The police officers have too much ego that they face civilians one-on-one. The problem starts there. Well, that is a problem. And now, by the way, I'm going to say, I've known a lot of good police officers over the years. As I mentioned, I have police officers in my family. And I've known, quite a few who are in ethical quandaries about what happens with their forces. But there is a tendency, and this is why we need screening of police officers, so we can get the people who are in it for the wrong reasons out of policing and keep them out for good. We also need to have like a national database where if somebody gets fired from a police department for something, they can't get hired at other departments, because this is another big problem that we have because of our decentralized non-system of policing. So yeah, there's a lot of like interpersonal dynamics that are a result of, you can call it ego, I would call it being vicious morally. All right, Meek and Pure, I think there's real oppression towards African Americans in America, and George Floyd does deserve justice, but I disagree with the burning of businesses and lootings. Violence doesn't lead to peace. Well, it allows you to make the case. Yeah, it's better if instead of local businesses being burned, that it's, say, police headquarters, as we saw, or the courthouse, or I'm all for the places that are defacing the Confederate statues that are there. Those things should have been gone a long time ago, and only haven't because of racism. But if that's what it takes, I mean, here's the thing to keep in mind for all the people who want to bring up MLK and nonviolent protests and all that. Read a letter from a Birmingham jail. What is the thing that Martin Luther King says? He says, well, he gives all these arguments against the white liberals and against, people who are like, oh, you need to take more time and all that. He says, no, the time is now for changing things. And either you deal with people like me who are willing to let our skulls be cracked and police dogs sicked on us because all of you are such scumbags that want to use that sort of force. And either you deal with us, or you can deal with the people who are going to engage in all sorts of other things. The people who are going to be violent. Make a choice, because it's going to be one or the other. And I think we can say a similar thing today. Yeah, it's not good that businesses are being burned down or looted or anything like that. That said, Walgreens has insurance, and so does Target, and it's a property crime. It's not actually beating somebody's skull in with a baton or shooting a rubber bullet into their eye or things like that, which are actions against persons, which are being done much more by the police than by the protesters. So I think we need to keep things, proportionate in mind. That's the one thing that I think philosophy might be able to contribute, is relentlessly drilling in distinctions. Destroying property is not the same thing as destroying a person. That's a key distinction that somebody has to keep in mind if they're going to engage in moral, ethical reasoning about this. All right, John Doe says we need to abolish the police. Great. Tell me how that's going to happen and what's going to replace them that isn't going to look like the police. I mean, it's nice to have that sort of ideology. I think that people who have that sort of ideology, my friend Irfan commented in a Facebook thing about somebody who was an abolitionist and said, well, we do need these people because they push something forward, and that's good. But how's that going to happen? I mean, I think we need to be very realistic in the changes that we're demanding. I think that we want to push for getting rid of police unions. That's doable. That's going to be very, very, very hard, but that's doable. Getting rid of all police altogether, I don't see how that's going to happen. So, all right, Bruce asks, what about economics now? Do I think that the economy is going back to where it was? And that can be an exacerbating factor. I mean, we could call it the COVID displacements have fallen more heavily on minority communities. They sure as hell haven't affected police budgets. The economy was bad for a lot of people before we got into this. The economy is never closed. We just actually had an order come in today from Costco. There's a shopper who went and purchased things for us. We do that because we're not going ourselves to the store because I have somebody who's high risk in my family. So the economy never really closed. There's parts of the economy that are doing much worse and parts that are doing better. And we do have a lot of problems with like people not being able to pay rent or being out of work and having their unemployment terminated because of political machinations. Are we ever going to see like a return to previous levels? Think about the previous 2008, 2007 to 2010 or 11 economic crisis, right? By 2012, we saw a lot of things getting back to normal, but the new normal wasn't good for a lot of people. So I think that's something we need to focus on as well. But that's a good question. All right. More people talking about who their teachers were. Olivia says, I think you're missing a key part of this career criminals thing, namely that people go into the informal economy because of white supremacy and the economic privation it brings. Yeah, and I'm not talking about career criminals in that sense. So let me specify. When I talk about career criminals and I'm talking about people looting things, I'm not talking about people who are engaging in non-documented economic transactions. I'm talking about the kind of people who I taught when I was in maximum security prison teaching. The kind of people who are out there and are like, well, there's disorder. I'm going to take advantage of this. And there is that element, and you're always going to have that, but that doesn't define a protest, right? That's going to be a pretty small number of people. And we also ought to mention there's right-wingers out there stirring crap up as well, right? So it's not as if most of the protesters are in any way engaging in violence. As a matter of fact, some have been reining people in as well. Sunflower says, they're in Iran. They've observed and been part of this kind of chaos in result of poor action or dictator politicians. Yeah, Iran is a mess. Has been a mess for quite a long time. That's something that would be kind of good for us to keep in mind, particularly going back to that comment about the police state that is America. Things could be much, much, much worse, and sometimes if we think about the racial oppression and exploitation that's taken place in our past, directed at African Americans, but also directed, we can say at Native Americans and Hispanics and really across the board. It's been much worse, right? But this is still bad. This is still, we could say, it's still at a level that's morally unacceptable when it comes to policing and racial inequalities and disparities and what's being done to address them and what gives people a seat at the table. So, all right. Meek and Pure says 400 years of racial injustice that was ignored for too long caught up to us, and a lack of love on the side of people burning and looting businesses. Yeah, I mean, that's all rather abstract stuff. I think the offenses that people are worried about are more like what's happened in the last 5 years than in the last 400. But, you can have that as a back burner kind of issue as well. Shit says burn down the cities, tear down the Parthenon. Again, it's about as useless as a response as the let's justify the police or the let's abolish the police. These sort of total solutions aren't really solutions for us. We need to have realistic, we can do something about this in the present kind of things that we can address, where we can do what we talk about as consistent pressure relentlessly applied. Meek and Pure, society doesn't thrive without laws and order. Yeah, that's true. And the laws and order need to actually themselves be lawful and orderly, not falling on some people more than on others without some good reason, and not perpetuating systematic injustice. Otherwise, the laws and order cease being laws. I mean, this is recognized as early on as Cicero and Saint Augustine, that legal systems that are not preserving justice cease to be legal. There's some sort of measure, some sort of standard that we have. This is something that runs throughout thought, all the way, by the way, from Aristotle to Martin Luther King, of talking about there being a superior law that judges the laws and the enforcement of the law that we have in place. That's what allows us to be moral beings, not just having laws and not just having order, because your order could be an oppressive order, an exploitative order. All right. I just jumped a bit, so a lot of comments here. Let's skip back up to where we were. And I'm going to try to address these fairly quickly so I can catch up a bit rather than going into. Here we go. Byangaran says, build up the cities. Yeah, I would love to see that a lot more. I would love to see a lot more constructive solutions to things. That's not as sexy and not as attention getting, and often draws a lot more energy from people, but it's what we ought to do. All right. Jay Cloyd says, it's a shame about your followers. Thanks for making a principled stand on this issue. Yeah, I mean, I've lost some over the years for talking about the current corrupt Republican administration and what's going on here in Wisconsin, but that's okay. You're always going to shed some. Gabriel Souza, big civil marches are much better to bring attention to the cause. Yeah, and we're having big civil marches. I mean, it's not as if we only have violent protests. We're having violent protests at times and clashes with the police, and we have like demonstrations and marches going on all over the place as well. All right. Here is 1916 Rev. Do I believe, using Hannah Arendt's formulation, that the violence being used by the police is undermining their power? That's a good question. Is it undermining their power? Yes, it is undermining their power, because legitimacy is part of power. And when the police are genuinely perceived across the board as illegitimate, they're going to have less and less compliance, and they're going to have to use more and more brutal tactics. And that is going to lead to more and more problems. By the way, if you want to talk about economic issues, you want to have a recovery, we're going to have a recovery by people being free to do things. If we have, lots and lots of curfews and clampdowns and stuff like that, because of bad policing and bad leadership, we're going to have even more of a problem. John Reeves says, the police killed a man. Let's have the police investigate that, ? This is a problem. Having the police and having that particular prosecutor, who knows how many deals he's cut with less evidence than what he's looking at there for all sorts of criminals, to try to coerce them into plea bargains. Yeah, we probably need external oversight of some sort. Unfortunately, the DOJ right now, who's running it, right? So we're not going to get any help from that angle, because they're going to be very pro-police, almost in a knee-jerk way. But we do need something. Mother says, Arendt, referencing the banality of evil, went down this cul-de-sac with finding otherwise ordinary men do horrible things. For brevity, I will say penalties should be severe for cops breaking the law. Yeah. Now, the cops that are doing this sort of stuff are not ordinary men doing bad things. They're people who chose to become part of a police force. And many of them, I mean, you can watch some of these videos where you can see them like, all adrenaline junkied up, ready to go out and crack some heads. I know what that's like, because when I was doing martial arts, you'd see people like that, and there's plenty of other circumstances as well. So it's not just, oh, well, if bad system people can do bad things without realizing it. No, some of these people want to go out there and do bad stuff. John Doe, how does Marx tie into this? I mean, not in any immediate way, although I would say that One thing that Marx and Engels do point out in the Communist Manifesto is that there is a particular class of society that is always willing to be like lined up with the oppressors. Um, all right. Percy says, thank you for your work. Thank you very much as well. Can't read these symbols, but it says, in fact, we ordinary people just want to have a better life and better family. For protests, we can't make our life better. We just want work and health. I think that's the case. I don't think that most people who are engaging in the protests are, what we could call like professional activists, who are like, oh, this is amazing. Now we've got a chance to go out and do this. There's always going to be some, right? But a lot of them are just people who are so fed up with how things have been going. Shit says, oh, okay, here, just all sorts of nonsense about AOC. So I'm going to get rid of that. Keep it relevant, and keep it accurate. So Emmerich says, you're militarizing police. Great idea. Nice speech. Way to put more oil on the fire. Platitudes everywhere in this vid. Oh, cool. Get rid of that one as well. All right, meek and pure. Injustice is real and should be called out, but we should love each other at the same time. That's a very good point. And it is possible to be loving and to resist evil at the same time and to call it by its name. As a matter of fact, it's not as if there's an immediate cause and effect, but making the other person who's engaging in wrongful behavior realize that it's wrongful behavior is a good act of itself. All right, I'm going to skip over the Stirner one. Okay, so Stu Billy says, here in Flint, we had a very peaceful march where the police marched with the protesters. Please look up the story for more details than I can give here. I posted that on Twitter and I posted that on Facebook as a good example of a different model of policing. It was the sheriff, the county sheriff, who, along with his deputies, marched and then gave a address to the people. And there wasn't violence. And that is something possible to do. So, the people who are like, oh, well, you've got to clamp down, got to have law and order. Well, there's different ways of doing that. One is to actually deal with oppressed human beings as human beings. All right. Jorge says, here in Spain, we also have problems with police force. What should we do with this structure that affects all countries? So, in Spain, you have a more centralized police force than we do here in the United States. And that means that in some respects, you have better prospects for actually doing something about it, I think. Then, here, it's like whack-a-mole, right? You get an officer who's a terrible person fired in one place, and they go a couple municipalities down and they get a job again at another place, and then they start doing the same stuff, right? Or they go and become a correctional officer. I think countries that do have a more unified approach to it, like Spain or France, even Britain, have a much more easier way to go than we do. All right, Watergate 2.0. The police should be trained to handle situations better, similar to how people are trained in the military. Yeah, now the military isn't always, the training that we get there isn't always great either, but it's certainly way better than what happens in a lot of policing. And there has to be continual retraining too. That's a key thing. I think you can't just say, okay, we're going to, I was talking with another person about this on Facebook. These like implicit bias workshops that you got to sit in for 4 hours, those don't do a thing. All those do is tick something off on a compliance thing so they can say legally, well, we actually have addressed this. A lot of times the people involved in those don't take them seriously. How do I know this? Because it's not just cops who get that. It's also us educators and it's other professions that get these essentially compliance training things. We need something that goes a lot deeper, that gets its hooks into people, and that gets buy-in from people. And that's not going to be done with the stuff that we currently require of them. And it's going to have to be continually renewed. Leadership is going to have to care about it as well. All right. John, Plato descended into democracy, would eventually descend into a tyranny. Wouldn't this be a reflection of the current status in America? I don't think you can map what's happening in Plato's Republic, Book 8, easily onto what happens in a giant nation state, which is much more complex. So, no, I would not agree with that. Zun Nuz, does cultural integration work? Too broad a topic. Not sure it has anything to do with this. All right. A little bit of off-track stuff here. I'm going to get... here's a great question. Abioma, do you think there's a fair parallel between just war theory and unspoken expectations about a kind of just civil war disorder theory? Yes. And good ethical training for police that actually encompasses moral theory will include discussions of just war theory, because it has to do with the use of force. You can analogize from that. And when we're talking about just war theory, we're talking about the stuff that goes all the way back, again, to Cicero, Augustine, Aquinas, all of this reflection on that. Many of those principles apply just as well to policing. It's a matter of actually getting that out there that is quite difficult. All right. Randy Zweig, unions are largely corrupt. I've seen that in the trades. That's a whole other discussion. Labor unions, yeah, there's lots of problems with them, including the fact that it's often they're not working for the common person the way they may have done way in the past. Unions are often kind of their own little elite clique. I know this in part because I'll give you a prime example. My uncle, right, who at this point in time is a union iron worker. In the past, he was a drywaller, and they would have these carpenters union people come down to his jobs when he was non-union and say, "You need to put 3 guys of ours onto the job," and he'd be like, "You gonna put any of our guys onto your jobs?" And they, hell no. They were demanding and not giving anything for the ordinary person. Iron workers, it took him actually having his son be in the iron workers and giving him a referral to get in there and then get all the great free education and jobs and stuff like that. Yeah, there's a whole conversation to be had about the labor union movement. Police unions are a whole different thing. Police unions are not labor unions. They are their own animal. And I think they need to be abolished. I'm not saying police need to be abolished. Police unions do. So... all right, Diabolus Ex Machina, you've obviously pointed to the problem of militarism in police. In your opinion, is it more helpful or useful to see this as a racial issue? When does it become a problem? So I don't think the militarization, let me say, of police is a particularly racialized issue. I think that it has to do with the fact that the Bush administration made all this military equipment readily available for police organizations, and many of them took advantage of it, and they should have never been afforded that opportunity. There is, unless we're like dealing with like serious criminal organizations, like hardcore gangs and stuff like that, there's no reason why police should have military grade weaponry out on the street. They shouldn't have armored cars and things along those lines. And there's other things going on as well. Some people have been posting videos of the police, for example, going to places where the protesters have gathered jugs of milk and like pouring all that stuff out. What are they doing there? They're trying to destroy supply lines for those who engage in protest. Now, what's going on there? There's a mentality of us versus them, and the people being the enemy, and that's militarism. That's not proper policing. So, all right. There's a thing. I'm sure President Trump will manage things well in the end. He'll bring us to a brighter future. Yeah, I don't think so. That's such nonsense. I mean, anybody who at this point thinks that Trump cares at all about Americans, or indeed even about people in his administration, haven't been paying attention. New card, doesn't the amount of guns in the U.S. make police brutality inevitable? I don't think so. What's keeping the number of guns high is actually the Republican NRA coalition, and that tends to favor the cops. There's a lot of overlap between those people. You don't see the right to bear arms being exercised primarily by African Americans, do you? You know, I mean, you could say, well, what about illegal guns and the cops have to be armed? Okay, sure, but that doesn't have anything to do with protests and marches and stuff like that and how they're dealing with that. That's ordinary policing, right? So, all right, let's go on. Pika Welchmerch says Durkheim's concept of protest or looting is an expression of untouched social needs, provide insight as to the function of this situation. Yeah, but in a trivial way. I mean, I think that's one of those things where it's become basically part of the understanding, whether we've read Durkheim or not, of how these things work. So, yeah. Robert Kipps, have you seen the video of military-looking police walk down residential neighborhoods in Minneapolis and shoot projectiles at people in their front porch to force them inside their own homes? Yes, I have, of course. And if I remember right, those are not police; those are actually National Guard. But they may be police, and they may as well, be police. All right, Vathanak says, as Fanon says, to be able to free the marginalized through revolution, violence is necessary. Our protesters entitled to use of violence, considering the systemic oppression they are under. So entitled, meaning morally justified, I would say in some cases yes, in some cases no. I think as soon as the police start using violence on protesters en masse, that they, anything goes then. If they want to, heavily armed, start throwing tear gas at people, then too bad for the police. Is it sort of a general principle that, well, if you're oppressed, you can use violence? I don't think so. If we do that, then everybody uses violence, right? And we don't have a society for very long. Jay Cloyd suggests, what if police officers had to be elected by the community they police? I think we'd be better off. Yeah, that would be quite interesting. Or let's expand that, because I think that's actually a great, kernel of an idea. What if police officers had to be accountable in, say, monthly meetings where their actions were reviewed by community members, by people who they police? What if police officers were indeed required to live in the communities that they police? What if police officers were required to send their children to school in the communities that they police? And we could go on and on and on, right? You could say, well, then they become like held hostage, I guess, or maybe they'll be a lot more accountable and actually like see other people as members of their community. All right. Austin Noonan, it seems the people have no power anymore. Police are getting away with anything they want. What schools of philosophy offers a solution besides Stoicism? I don't think that Stoicism per se offers a solution. I mean, the solution that Stoicism would offer is get involved in organization against the police. It would not be, withdraw yourself from stuff. And I notice you use the lowercase s Stoicism. That's not actual Stoicism. Stoicism was about, the cardinal virtues: wisdom, courage, temperance, and what's the other one? Justice. If you look at Cicero and you look at the actual Stoics and you see the fact that some of the ones who we don't have writings from got in trouble with the government for protesting against the government and holding them to standards, you would probably not be inclined to view Stoicism as just a withdrawal from things, but saying, we have to be involved with things. I think we can use other. Aristotle talks about the use of violence and force. He criticized the Spartans for being all about fighting and victory and losing sight of everything else that's important in life. Aristotle, by the way, even discusses in the Politics the need to have some sort of carceral institution within the city, and he gives some guidelines for it. But going back to your other point, it seems that people have no power anymore. Yeah, the police have been given far too much power. I think there's a lot of things that are now considered crimes that probably should be taken off the books. We're in a situation where if you have a police dog coming after you and you defend yourself against it, you're considered to have attacked a police officer. But police officers can come in and shoot your dog. or if you if you do anything, it can be considered resisting arrest. A lot of those things need to go. And it's going to be very difficult for that to happen because prosecutors love that stuff. It gives them leverage over people to charge them for crimes. And we do have an incentivized system where prosecutors are often rewarded the more people they put behind bars. All right, let's go on. Meek and pure, police need to build a better relationship with the community. Yeah, exactly. That does need to happen. Ryan Henderson, we need community control of police. They should be drawn from the communities they will police. Too many officers don't live in and have a vested interest in its well-being. I think that's completely correct. All right. Luke Appleberry, police shouldn't be elected. Could you imagine a criminal voting in a cop? How that relationship work out? That's not a real objection. I mean, so what? What's the proportion of criminals within the general populace? So you're going to say that the general populace shouldn't have a say in who is policing them because criminals exist in there? I mean, some of those criminals are cops, by the way, right? All right, let's go on. A lot of back and forth. Says, how can we reduce the crime rates in the first place so that these incidents don't happen? Can punishment reduce crime rates, or is education the only way to reduce crime rates? There is no simple one key solution to reducing crime rates. Crime rates have been going down. I mean, they have been going down historically for quite a while with most types of crimes. We often see a disjunction between, spending on police and crime rates. Here's a good observation by Ian Profano. A lot of pain and many, many problems today. Yeah, that's something that we need to keep in mind. And when we're discussing this, we're not discussing merely abstract issues that we can feel emotional about. We're talking about real human people that get get hit by a rubber bullet or get tear gassed or, suddenly are in fear as they see a phalanx of cops coming at them and have no idea what they're going to be doing, and then hear other sirens coming from behind them. We're dealing with people who get, searched for reasons that are often just about terrorizing and keeping people in check rather than actual policing. There's a lot of pain out there, and a lot of the anger comes from the pain, not just the pain existing, the pain not being acknowledged, the pain being told, well, that's your problem because you shouldn't have resisted arrest, or you shouldn't have, you have to be respectful. There's a lot of fear as well, especially among not just African-American men, but their families about what can happen to them. We live in an unjust society when it comes to racism and profiling and policing and all of these other things. So, my wife Andy sent me a text that some people think my CIA shirt is from the Central Intelligence Agency. I mean, all of you should know better than that. Culinary Institute of America, right? If you know anything about me, you know that I have a long-standing connection with them. So yeah, glad to put that to rest. All right, let me go down and see what else we have. So here's a comment that I think is completely wrong-headed. Doctor, now many people don't care about this incident at all. They just want to make the whole country turbulent. They have bad ideas. We shouldn't go on protesting like that. That is exactly the wrong-headed sort of idea that you should probably reconsider. And I know if you've posted a lot of things in here about how great Trump is and wonderful, blah, 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 blah. If you seriously think that people are just taking advantage of this to stir up trouble because they're real troublemakers, you are so deluded and out of touch with reality that you probably want to like stop following the channel and being involved in things, because I'm going to keep on saying stuff like this. Most of the people that are involved in these protests are involved because they've had enough. This was a catalyzing incident. All right. Wim van der Beg. Okay, so here's a great question. Is there no screening for police officers right now? I'm from the Netherlands, so I don't know. So again, unlike European and most other police forces all over the world, we do not have a central set of standards or oversight or rules or whatever you want. We have all of these different police departments and sheriff's departments and state troopers all over the place, and each one has its own set of standards. There's actually even multiple sets of standards that you could buy into from different policing organizations that come in and do training for you. They're not all on the same page. So in one municipality, you could have almost no training and very little screening at all. And in another place, you could have screening that's quite extensive. It really depends on what the leadership wants and what they're willing to pay for and all these sorts of factors. All right. The truth. I think Marcus Aurelius would have a lot to say regarding both the virus and the protesting. Yeah, probably so. Jimmy D, shouldn't we ask ourselves what's wrong with our ideologies and systems that give birth to these people? It depends on what people you're talking about. Nancy Martin, what is the cumulative factor of the frustration we feel at the constant abuse of power and above the law behaviors of public officials in recent years? Okay, so that's a broader question. It's not just the cops. It's also other public officials, including those who are representatives and are all the people within the executive agencies at the federal and the state level, and oftentimes here in a big city like Milwaukee, in terms of the city officials. I actually remember having a phone conversation with the city engineer when they changed the name of our street and didn't bother to update Google or Facebook and said, hey, you have a moral obligation here to make sure that they're getting accurate information. And they laughed in my face, and I got a little heated with them. So you can encounter this sort of frustration all the time. I think it bears much more heavily on some people than it does on others. And when it gets to a certain point, it's going to blow over, or it's going to blow up, rather. I'll give you a prime example. So we had a curfew last night here in Milwaukee, and the fine for violating the curfew was a very strange $691. So one of our local sort of officials, Judge Derek Mosley, went on and explained on Facebook that the fine is actually $500. Then all the other $191 is add-ons like processing fees and stuff like that. That to me seems like just ways to screw people over, ways to engage in predatory practices as a government. And there's lots of that. That's part of why Ferguson was such a powder keg, because so many people in Ferguson were getting hit with all these crazy fines and extra court charges and things for fairly trivial offenses, and they would end up going into debt because of it and losing their houses. And on top of that, you have the unjust racist policing, right? So there's a lot of these frustrations that we need to deal with. All right. Nefarious 401, unfortunately, a large portion of the American population doesn't understand that destroying property is not destroying a person. I think you're right about that. And I think they're very selective about that, too. All right. M. Felice, can you comment on Candace Owens, to paraphrase, that if we truly care about Black lives, why not report on the tens of thousands of murders instead? RE anti-police propaganda. Candace Owens is just a shill and quite frankly, an idiot. Or if she's not an idiot, she's certainly playing one. So I don't take her seriously at all. We do report on that. It gets reported on all the time. Turn on the local news sometime. I mean, that's all you get for Milwaukee and Chicago is this murder happened here, this murder happened here. But why can't we report on both? This is one of those sort of false dilemmas that these ideologues like to put into place. Well, if you're really concerned about this, you've got to talk about this instead. No, you can talk about both. There's a wide enough span within the internet that we can actually get to both of these. All right. Adam says, I think there's a business incentive to increase funding for police because the private companies that provide materials benefit and police can demand more funding because of increasing violence. That is a dynamic that does happen. Yeah, I think that a lot of times shop owners themselves have to be quite worried about the police, particularly if they're minorities. So I don't know that that's a universal dynamic. Jake Lloyd says, if you destroy stores, you destroy lots of jobs where people are economically insecure. You destroy some, but you don't necessarily destroy lots. And the stores have, it depends on who the store is. If it's a local mom and pop, that's a much bigger problem. If it's Target, they have insurance. If it's Walgreens, they're covered, and they'll rebuild. So I don't really buy that. Let's go further down. Slam RN, did you just say the economy wasn't that good before the coronavirus hit? How can you say that? What are you talking about? Well, that's pretty straightforward and simple. The economy wasn't that good for a lot of people, is what I said. So you got to pay close attention. And yeah, it wasn't. There's lots of people who are, working in the gig economy and don't have any insurance coverage. Or, I mean, if you're on the ACA like I am, you pay a lot for that. There's a lot of people who lost their coverage. Healthcare costs have been going way, way up. Wages have been stagnant for a long time. I mean, if you thought the economy was good for most people before the coronavirus hit, you've been swallowing Fox News propaganda too much. And you probably want to look a little bit more closely at how most other people live. So, I mean, this is a no-brainer, this one, right? All right, Kendall, can you talk about the current Hong Kong situation and a potentially global civil unrest? I don't see this as leading to a global civil unrest, and I see zero connection between the Hong Kong situation and what's happening over here. I think the two situations have to do with civil unrest and do involve protests and policing, but that's about as far as you get. So I don't see those connected with each other. All right. Let's see what else we've got. It just jumped again in the thing, so that tells me there's a lot more comments. Scrolling back up to a lot of back and forth here. All right. Boy, I'm definitely not going to get to all of these comments and questions that people have. Okay, so here we go. Finally back where I was before. A lot of things that are kind of irrelevant here. Okay, Watergate 2.0. What kind of police reform do you think we can enforce on the police? I think that they should be trailed like if a normal person committed a crime. Yeah, so the big thing that you're asking there, what can we actually enforce? And this is where I think, we need to be quite clear that what we want is some pretty rigorous, oversight and enforcement, and that, we're going to have to fight over and over again for little bits and pieces and make it more and more and more. And we're not gonna accomplish this without getting buy-in from at least some police, where they can see that it's better for them if the bad apples can't spoil the bunch. So one great example is the cameras that a lot of police have to have now. That should be mandatory. All the things that they're doing, the camera should be on all the time if they're on duty, and there shouldn't be any it takes 5 months to get a hold of the camera footage. That should be available to everybody. That's one thing we could push for. It would take a long time to actually get it, but it would be an accomplishment. And so, I think we can come up with all sorts of other examples. All right. One of those guys says, when plunder becomes a way of life for a group of men in society, over the course of time, they create for themselves a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it. Bastiat. That's exactly what happened in Ferguson with the predatory governmental fines and stuff like that. Um, Dylan Costco, would the government give equal amount of importance if the protests were peaceful? Probably not. That's the thing. Um, we don't want to say that violence is in some way a good thing in and of itself, but one of the consequences of it is that politicians do take things seriously when there are outbreaks. Um, Now, there's a suggestion here: the United States needs more colored people in police in cities. Okay, so there's this issue of representation, but there's also the issue of what we can call a police mentality. You know, quite often, uh, irrespective of race, police can take on racist attitudes um, because of the culture of their particular department. So that's a problem. Um, Austin Noonan, regarding your comments about decentralized police force systems, who polices local police? In my town, an officer shot and killed a woman driving away from a house party. They investigated themselves. There's the problem. In many cases, we don't have any sort of oversight that goes beyond, maybe they have an internal affairs division or something like that. But if it's small enough, the police do investigate themselves and, along with the local prosecutor, and they usually find that nothing happened, right? This is a big problem. Sometimes the Department of Justice will come in, but it has to reach like almost egregious status before the DOJ gets involved, and they usually don't get compliance from the law enforcement officers because it's a bad system, right? So, all right. Andrew Igan, why are Americans so undisciplined in protests that there's looting? Is it surprising from inside the U.S.? It's actually not that surprising, and it's not as if it's a uniquely American thing that looting takes place. But yeah, it usually does happen, and it doesn't just happen, by the way, for political protests. It happens when Americans win sports competitions, or lose them. People overturn cars and all that sort of stuff. We do have a big problem with that. Nefarious says there's a cultural problem in America where the large portion of the population believes anyone that's in contact with police is automatically guilty, and that it's the jury's duty to convict. That is indeed a problem. So, Slam RN, aren't most of the harsh quarantine orders coming from Democrat governors? Why is that? Well, because Democrat governors actually are willing to take the problem seriously. I wouldn't call them harsh. I'd call them prudent, and that's probably all we need to say about that. Adam McDonald. So here's a great point as well. Local governments equip their police better than the public healthcare workers. So there's two things to say about that. One is that's completely correct, that local governments are much more invested in policing than they are public health. The other is that this is reflected in budgets. Police draw far too much money from our tax base. Public health does not. We should be changing our priorities. And, here in America, that is a change. We didn't always spend quite so much on police as we do now. All right, let's go on. Suburban Legend asks, what's the Aristotelian view on social justice, in particular the current situation? That's complicated. I've got videos on that. You can take a look at them and read Nick McCann Ethics Book 5 and Rhetoric Book 1, and you'll get his take. All right. Dudes, what do you think about gangster culture influencing young people? I think the hostility towards police makes the police more hostile and vice versa. I would say that was more of an issue, I think, when I was younger than it is today. Like I remember when the LA riots were going on, and I was in college, and hearing the African American fraternity on campus, the betas playing NWA's, F the police over and over and over again, and people getting quite worked up about that. But the LA riots took place because of years and years and years of predatory policing, and similar things. There was worries about riots happening like here in Milwaukee and in Chicago and other places as well. Why? Because the African American community had been so oppressed. I don't think that the gangster culture is like the thing that we need to target the most. I think that's a useful, convenient sop for white liberals like, say, the Clintons. Um, and it's always a target for conservatives. But I don't see, I see the policing as driving that more than the gangster rap does. Um, all right. Jacob says a new mentality is needed within policing. Adopt a habit of exercising empathy, focus on de escalation instead of control by force, leverage understanding and reason, force prudence before justice. And I think that's very good. I think that we need to see a lot more of that. We may also still need to have some, hardcore, willing to use force behind that, but force should be used a lot less often than it currently is. SN Project, not sure if this has been asked earlier, but what do you suppose is the tendency for Americans to care more for property over fellow citizens? So I think it's selective. I think a lot of the people that are much more concerned about property over instead of worrying about people, they're concerned about property unless it was their people. So if the police were in their neighborhood and beating people up and pulling them over and slamming them into the ground and calling them all sorts of slurs and stuff like that, suddenly they would start caring about people. But they don't see these other people as people, and so they're much more worried about property, and that's part of the racist attitude. So I think that's part of what's going on there. All right, Stacy Washington says, in the end, if they were not trustworthy of the citizenry, they themselves will have good reason to fear the police. Yeah, I mean, the police create a lot of the fear. I don't know that it's really the master-slave dialectic, but yeah. All right, let's see here. So here's a question from Carol. I'm going to skip over most of the stuff there. Why is the movement called Black Lives Matter and not All Lives Matter? Because All Lives Matter is a code word for not taking Black Lives Matter seriously. And we have a greater problem here with Black lives being treated as expendable in comparison to white lives. It's that simple. I mean, if you need to insist on all lives matter, you're probably one of the lives that already matters. And you should rethink what you're doing and consider why other people need to stress that Black lives matter. It's been because people have been treating it as if they don't. So, all right. Let's see here. Ah, okay. Let's see. Scrolling down a bit more. A lot of back and forth about Trump. Let's see if we can get to anything that's really relevant. Here we go. Not as spectacular. Review boards have been established in the past, Atlanta, for example. However, these boards were dismantled as soon as the next election. Yeah, there's a big problem, right? There's a lot of measures that are taken basically just to provide, like, well, we're gonna appease the people who have a short memory span and are willing to say, oh well, we took some action and look at what we've accomplished. I think we need to be really cognizant at this point in time about keeping things in memory. And it's a good thing, I think, in these protests that so many people are not just saying George Floyd, but they're bringing up all the other, big cases of police using excessive force and killing African American men throughout the last decade and sometimes even before that. I think it's important to keep a long memory and, like I said, consistent pressure relentlessly applied and keeping people accountable. All right. Ursprung, Kant rejects revolutionary violence and violence protests by the same token as he accepts the possibility of a civilian's militia. Thoughts? I think Kant is not particularly relevant here. So I don't know why you would pick up on Kant, but that's all right. Oh, here's a good one by Kent By. Can you speak about the philosophy of truth and reconciliation commissions as a way to speak to the truth of injustices? South Africa has had some success with it, but U.S. seems to deny many aspects of history. Yeah, so that is quite important, and a lot of the anger, as I pointed out earlier, is not just because of injustice being done and things happening over and over and over again, where you can see a pattern of racist policing. It's also about the denial of it and the cover-ups of it, and the fact that if it wasn't for cell phones and recording a lot of these interactions, the police would have just gotten away with it, and the prosecutors or the investigating police would have, as so many have pointed out here, given their fellow officers or members of law enforcement a pass. I think that's a really important thing. Truth and reconciliation commissions can, in fact, accomplish a lot. It requires having, like I was saying, buy-in from the people who have engaged in the violence, and a willingness on their part to say, okay, I'm gonna own up to the things that have happened. And they're always controversial because they do involve typically some sort of amnesty for the offenses that have taken place in the past. And a lot of people have a problem with that. But we are going to need something like that in order to move on past this, as well as oversight, as well as retraining of police, as well as a lot of continual activism, I think. Not as spectacular has got a good point here. This is another thing that's typical of American policing and the justice system that's not necessarily typical of other places. Even if declared innocent, people are stuck with fines, fees, lawyers. An innocent that's poor takes just as much damage as the guilty. If you go to jail because the police decided that they wanted to make an example of you, you can look forward to losing your business, your job, your house, all sorts of things, and you won't get anything as recompense unless you can demonstrate to a jury and you get a lawyer to take your case for unlawful actions on the part of the police, which is not feasible in many cases. So, all right. Nefarious says police wear bulletproof vests because they're in danger of being shot. Therefore, shouldn't every black man wear a vest due to police presence? Actually, that makes a lot of sense. Matter of fact, we could go further and say that, like, until racial disparities in policing get addressed, maybe the cop budget should pay for those vests, right, to protect their citizens. All right, let's see. Mother says, if you look at the markers for clinical PTSD, you'll find the same markers reveal themselves in the outrage voiced by people in the lower socioeconomic rungs. That's quite true. As a matter of fact, I'll bring up something that's also quite interesting. I mentioned health disparities earlier, as well as policing and educational disparities. They did these interesting studies a while back, and they were looking at why are problems with pregnancies more common among African American women than they are in white women. And a lot of that can be attributed to stress and what living under a racist administration and regime and things like that can do to a person. The thing that was really the interesting kicker with this is they also looked at immigrant women from, say, the West Indies or from Africa. So people who would be, you'd look at them and say, aha, African American, but they're not actually African American. They're actually, say, African. And their numbers, when it came to pregnancies, complications, stillbirths, all that sort of stuff, were similar to that of white women. Their daughters' numbers were similar to those of African American women. What does this show you? That a lot of the health disparities that we see are the result of racism. And so we can talk about PTSD, we can talk about all sorts of other things as well. Let's see if we can find a good thing to go out on because we've been talking now for about an hour and a half, and I appreciate the comments and questions. Um, okay, so here's a very good one by Profoem. Do I think citizens have an ethical obligation to take part in local politics, staying informed and protesting? Yes, I do think that we do have an obligation, not just to vote, but also to engage our public officials, to be informed, to not necessarily to protest. I mean, maybe in some circumstances, it is particularly complicated by the fact that COVID is out there, and so we're going to have a spike in numbers because of that. Um, but certainly to communicate and to take part. Yes, I would say we do have an ethical obligation. I would say that that ethical obligation is much lower for those who are disadvantaged. And that there is also a corresponding ethical obligation on those who are privileged to act as allies for those who are disadvantaged. This is what solidarity means. And instead, of trying to use the system to further their own positions or to, set up boundaries to keep the disadvantaged out, I would say, yeah, there are some ethical obligations like that. So that is a great question to go out on. I thank everybody for joining me, and those of you whose questions and comments I couldn't get to, sorry. I mean, this happens every time, but it's important that we keep these discussions going. And I think what I'm going to say is I'm going to do starting this coming month, maybe an additional one like this, talking about these sorts of issues of justice, issues of solidarity, issues of society. That might be something good to do. All right, so thanks everybody, and I will see you in the coming month.